All right, this week we get to cover the topic of the right source. This is a topic we've been alluding to since day one. How do you find the right source? Well, there is a process, and we are going to cover that today. Among other things, we're going to talk about supplier evaluation techniques. How do you go through that process that I mentioned? What are some of the criteria that you may need to consider in your evaluation and selection process? And then there's a step-by-step process. I'm going to explain that I've used in the past. It works. It doesn't work for all products. It's not necessary to get in that level of detail, but you'll see what I mean when we get there. And then I'll wrap up this topic with some best practices. So this week, the presentation is all in one. There's no point breaking it up because there's a lot of content. We're just going to dive in. Let's talk about the objectives of purchasing again. By this point, you're probably sick of seeing this slide, but it's really important that we reference this every single time when we're talking about at least the 6 R's, the right source in this case. So when we talk about the right source, it should align the company that you do business with, their practices and their way of doing business should align with your company's best practices and way of doing business. The reason I say that is it just makes things so much easier. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to find suppliers that have a different way of running their business, and it doesn't mean you can't do business with them. It just means you may run into some challenges, and that's where the challenge of supply chain integration comes in. Most common way of thinking about this, if you have a supplier whose strategy is to be the low-cost leader, and they'll sacrifice quality to get there, they may not be the best source overall because they may be skimping in other areas as well that you may find valuable. So it may not fit in that alignment. Also, when it comes to right source, of course, we're concerned about supply continuity. Yes, we are. So finding the right source that can meet your continuity of supply needs is very important. Sometimes it's not just the communication, it's the supplier that is not the best fit. Now, the last thing, the process of selecting suppliers. This should be a very effective and efficient process. It shouldn't take years unless it needs to take years. And I assure you, it doesn't need to take years. There are other things that we can do to improve the process, and that comes down to the best practices as well. So this week we are in the last of the 6 R's, that finding the right source. We will talk about global sourcing in a coming week, but we're talking right now about, in general, the right source. Could be domestic, could be international, it doesn't matter. When we get to the point where we need to evaluate suppliers and select them, these are the major steps. I'm going to break each one of these down slide by slide here. So if you're furiously writing, you can put me on pause, but these are going to be the title headings here in the next few slides. So first thing is, you need to recognize the need for the supplier, that you even need one. And that may even be a hurdle. Just letting you know, sometimes within organizations, there's that battle of, should we make it or should we buy it? That's okay. That's a worthy thing to have a conversation on in business. So first you got to recognize you need a supplier to even start this process. Seems like a blinding obvious thing, but it's a starting point. The next thing is, you got to figure out what requirements are going to be necessary in that sourcing process. What are you looking for in a supplier? Then determine the sourcing strategy that you're going to take. We'll break that down here in a minute. Identify the potential supply that you'll be sourcing from, the pool of suppliers potentially, and then limit that pool down. And then evaluate how you're going to select and evaluate them when you do get bids or proposals, and then reach an agreement. So let's start with recognizing it. These are the times in which you recognize you need a new supplier. This isn't a process you go through when you're trying to pick from an existing supply base. This is when you don't have someone to fill this need. This can happen when you're doing new product development. Your engineering team or product development team could be needing something that is different than what you have now. This can also take place when you have current suppliers that aren't meeting your needs, meaning poor quality, poor performance in any way, shape, or form. Could be even poor price. at the end of the day, it could mean that your contract with a good supplier is coming to an end. And what you need to do is, instead of just re-upping that, do some due diligence and see if the competition out there has gotten better since your contract started. That's what we call a market test as well. You're just going to go test the market, see what's out there. My husband tries to do that with me on cars. I can't stand it. But either way, it is a valid way of seeing if you're getting the best deal. During an outsourcing activity. So I worked for a company that went through a process of outsourcing a lot of the product that we were making internally. That's because we decided to stop being a vertically integrated organization into a design, assemble, test, and distribute organization. So we had to add a bunch of suppliers to our database, and we had to get them quickly. And a lot of that had to do with looking at our existing suppliers, see if they can take it on. And we realized they couldn't, so we had to get some more. Then there are situations where your company is growing and your current supply base doesn't have the capacity that you need to be able to do the job to meet your customers' need. And then lastly, sometimes you got to reduce the supply base. When I first started in purchasing, for example, I was one of the groups of products I worked on, or commodity for that matter, was labels. Labels that went on boxes, labels that went on product. And we had 10 or 15 different suppliers. It was over 10 for sure that were doing labels. We'd buy one from one supplier, two from another. And there was one supplier that had a bunch. And it didn't make sense for us to do that from a cost standpoint, but also from a supplier management standpoint, with all the specifications being shared. So we decided to limit our supply base and determine how many suppliers were the best fit for our business. We ended up with 2, primarily. Then we had a backup in each category. We had metal labels, and then we had adhesive, self-sticking labels that were paper-based or plasticized. So we had a couple suppliers in each category, 2 primary and a backup. Just give an example. We had to see if our current supply base couldn't meet those needs, how to limit it down. So you recognize them first. Okay, we have a need. Now what? Now we need to figure out what requirements we're going to put in place to evaluate them and see if they can meet these needs. Sometimes when you're gone through a painful time with a supplier and you're ending a contract or the performance isn't there, these requirements jump to your mind right away. When things are going well, or when you're ready to make a change in your business for the better on a more strategic level, sometimes it's a little harder to find these requirements. Where you can start is figure out what your customer requires from you. And that's supply chain thinking. What is your internal customer and your ultimate customer looking for? So when I talk to operations, they're like, we just don't want to run out. Well, yeah, we know that. Our customer, on the other hand, had other factors. They wanted things that were cost competitive. They wanted to know things that wanted us to provide environmentally compliant goods. So we couldn't have products like hexavalent chromium in our machined products. Weird things like that. But through the growing pains of dealing with supplier development and supplier performance issues, this is a short list. I know it doesn't seem like it. This is a short list of things that we found were most important as for sourcing requirements for our suppliers. We need to assess their ability to manage their own business. Why does that matter? Well, I used to have suppliers all the time ask me for payment changes and payment in advance or things like that that were not standard to our agreement because they were having problems managing their money. That also goes with financial stability. But also, are they able to deal with the management challenges of running their own business? Sometimes I'd have to step in. It just seems so weird, but it is true. And sometimes we had to look at their ability for their employees. Are they capable of meeting the objectives we're asking them to meet? We talked about price. You knew cost structure might show up here. You got to understand that. We don't make sure that we're having a level playing field when we're comparing bids. You might have their philosophy on quality, technical capabilities, ability to operate in an e-commerce level. I had suppliers that still could not use email. That was really, really frustrating when I wanted to email them their order, or our system automatically sent them an email update. And they didn't know how to check it. They still wanted fax or mail, for that matter. And then if you really want to get deep, look into things like how they source from their suppliers, their policies, and their techniques. And in this first step engagement phase, you might not be able to get that deep, but you can see from their behavior and ask them how things are going with their supply base, what their metrics are, things like that. And then whether or not they have long-term relationship potential. So what each organization needs to do is figure out what's important to them. Sometimes this changes between products, whether it be a commodity or a special or a critical product. You may have a different set of sourcing requirements. Also, the long-term relationship factor may be different. Once you figure out what's important to you, then figure out how you're going to go at this. There's different sourcing strategies that I mentioned in your text as well. There's a single source strategy where I'm only going to buy from one source versus multiple sources. Now, I worked in a business for a long time where we had a single source strategy because it took so much money and time to validate a second source with our customer base. Now I work in an industry where we have multiple sources, and that's quite okay. In fact, if we had more, that'd be even better. So it depends on what industry you're in as much as what strategy you want to hit. So there's some benefits of single source. Easier to manage, for example. But you might run into issues, and that's the risk you take if the single source is not available. You can have a short-term sourcing strategy. You're looking for meeting a need within the next year, or a long-term sourcing strategy. You're looking for the long haul. So I would have long-term agreements with suppliers for engine life. Engine life would be 15 years. It's a long time in business. Keep that in mind. Things that may or may not matter to you is whether or not you're buying direct from the manufacturer or you can buy through a distributor. There's a low level of service that can be provided at either level in the supply base, but it could be whether or not you have design control change capabilities. That's one aspect. And then you have the opportunity to source domestically or internationally. That's mostly what people think when they think sourcing strategy. For a while there, I worked in a company that their sourcing strategy in the early 2000s was, we must get 20 new international suppliers in the next year. It just seemed like a strange number to come up with, but we did it. Other people said, we want 15% source from Asia. They'll have a percentage target to go source after. Of course, fitting the right need. Then you have this thing where I've actually had to be in these decisions where our engineering team couldn't support the design aspect of the business. They didn't have the expertise. So we'd have to go after suppliers that could do that kind of design expertise. So determine the strategy. What's important to you first, then go after the strategy. How are you going to lay this out? Then go after who we're going to put in that fits the requirements and the strategies. Where can you find these suppliers? Where are they hiding? One of the things I used to hate to hear is from my engineers or other people, I Googled it. I found the supplier off of Google, or I got this sales guy that reached out to me via LinkedIn. Yes, that is a valid method, that internet searches, which is bottom of the list here purposely. It is valid. There are other ways. Start with your current supply base first. If they don't meet the requirements or fit within your sourcing strategy, move on. If there is sales representatives that come and call on your business, you can listen to them, most certainly. And if you got purchasing in your title or buyer, you're going to start getting cold calls, and you're going to hate it unless you like talking to telemarketers or getting cold calls. I don't, but there was a few times where, I had to stop and force myself to listen and really see if they would be a good fit. And having those requirements identified up front does help in that decision. There are databases, trade journals, trade directories, trade shows are great. Find ways, new suppliers, experience. If you go to one company to another company, bring that experience with you. You'll know the suppliers that you liked working business with and ones you didn't. And sometimes you got to give them a second chance in different industries as well. Second party information is the equivalent of I know a guy or gal for that matter. Could be you join a professional organization like Apex and you meet other people and they tell you, hey, I'm doing business with this person. That's called second party. Internal sources, sometimes it's as simple as management coming down and telling you, this is a supplier I want you to look into. It used to happen to me all the time. Our general manager would come down in my office and say, hey, I met this guy at this function and well, maybe they can do business with us. And then I have to go through the evaluation process. Sometimes it was non-negotiable whether or not we're going to do business with them too. And lastly, internet searches. That should not be the first place you start. It shouldn't. How much time should you spend on this? It's a question I get all the time. Okay, here is a nice little matrix for you. Here you have your capability of your current supply base. If you have high capability in your supply base and the product is highly important to your business, then how much time, now, how much intensity should you spend or time should you spend go searching for new suppliers? You say they're highly capable. Well, you may have to go and look at your supply base a little bit more intently and go look at other options for competitiveness, doing market tests, as well as doing comparisons of their technical capabilities in the marketplace. I have suppliers that tell me we're top in our game, and I start doing research. I'm like, no, you're not. So this is how you do it. So a medium level of intensity. What this could mean to you is maybe 16 hours of work. It depends on your organization. You have to line this out. Capability of current suppliers is high, but low strategic importance. Don't be searching for a ton of new suppliers unless you have to. Now, if your suppliers are not currently capable of meeting your requirements or needs, and there's a high strategic level of importance, you better spend a lot of time going after them. And lastly, not the low performance, low strategic importance, but you really need to replace them. Spend some time. Get a medium level effort there. So you get to define what low, medium, high means right for you. And if you're in a buying role and you've got a purchasing manager that you're working with, establish what that means, low, medium, and high. So you're not wasting company time and overly researching. It's called analysis, paralysis by analysis, and you'll get stuck. So if you are the purchasing manager, one of the things that I said for myself is high level of intensity could be 40 hours plus. Medium is half a week, and low is a day minimum or maximum on that. Once you get a pool of suppliers, it's time to limit them. You can't have everyone in the pool. It's exhausting to go through the bidding process. Do what makes sense for your organization. Things you need to look at are financial risk. Are they going to default? Are they going to be able to pay their own bills? That is very, very important. Some people think small businesses can be super, super healthy. You just need to give them the right levels of growth over time so they can meet their financial needs. Evaluations of how they've done before or they've done with other customers is an interesting way to look at it, and it works. If they have poor reviews with their other customers, unless their customers are on the same page, meaning they've colluded on their reviews, and I highly doubt it, there's probably an issue there. And then evaluation of information they provided you about themselves. Actually fact check. Just like employers do when you apply to a job. They will fact check you. They'll call your references. Do the same. Limit the pool down the best you can. And one way you can do that is by establishing those pool limitation needs. It could be proximity as well. Another method is create a evaluation and selection process. So evaluation of what the suppliers say about themselves, go visit them. I hear horror stories all the time, and you don't hear them as much now, but I've heard horror stories in the past when China was developing as a resource for the United States for manufactured goods. You would hear stories like, oh, the quote looked nice, the sample products they sent over looked great, but that first shipment was terrible. It looked nothing like the sample. Yes, it did happen. It happens with domestic company as well. What happens when you go and you visit the supplier, it shows your intention, but also you can, with your eyes, be able to see and evaluate and ask questions in real time when you do that evaluation step. Use preferred suppliers if you can. If you have a database of suppliers that you have approved, use them. If they do not meet the needs, then go through and evaluate. So here's an example of what I used at Parker. It is not complete, it's just a snippet. What it shows you, and I know it's tiny, is, and it's for a reason, you have different categories like quality and material availability. These were 2 of 7 different major categories that we evaluated all new and current suppliers with. What I mean by new suppliers is if we knew that our current base couldn't meet the needs, what we would do is we would go through and say what is most important to us. And what we have here is what we call a Likert scale or rating system of 1 to 5 points. So in the area of quality, we would go and send our quality engineers out there and they would audit the supplier and give us a score. In order for them to even be considered, they had to have a 70% on that quality score. Then they can work to improve that with the quality team. But in the meantime, that was minimum. We would go through and look at things like their current on-time delivery performance with their other customers as a method if they aren't doing business with us currently. We would have them show us how they calculated that, even pull some data, even contact their customers if they weren't our competitors, right? So at the end of it there was a total score of 100 points. And sometimes there was a yes or a no, or a 1 point or 5 points. Either way, it was a numerical way of providing an evaluation or an assessment of where the supplier was at currently. This is the same tool, by the way, we used with all of our key suppliers to find ways to develop them. So if a supplier scored at a 2, we would work with our team to develop them and improve their practices and improve their performance to at least a 3 or a 4. Moving on. So having a tool like this, by deciding what is important to you first, you can then start this type of assessment. And it doesn't have to be too complicated either. Now, the supplier selection survey that I just showed you, you identify that need, you can start digging into that immediately. Then when you go out there and you start bidding, the survey or the matrix of measuring which supplier you want to do business with is this next step. So you determine what criteria makes sense for you. This can be the same as before, but most likely it's more specific to actually procuring the product. Things like location, things like price, and then you add a weight, and I give you here an example here in a minute. Then you define a scoring system, and then you evaluate each bid directly, or each supplier directly. Usually this is at the bidding process. From the ratings, then you determine which one is the supplier you want to go with. Review this process with your internal parties. It could be another buyer or your manager to make sure that there's no bias in play, and document all assumptions. The evaluation and selection part, whether it be the one I showed you just previously, the evaluation assessment, you should review that with your supplier at the end so they can improve. The selection of supplier you're going to source to, the next slide, is something you may not want to share with them because it has other supplier rating information, but you can tell them where they fit in the rank as far as first, second, or third. So here's an example of a sourcing matrix. So the sourcing matrix, what it's showing is, this is actually what I used to use quite frequently. We have unit cost, we have the rating system at the top, and in your term project this is going to come up. If you want to reference this, you can, or use this example. You may want to revisit this presentation when you do part 2. Either way. So you have unit cost, a scale to, if it's the lowest cost, it's 0 points, 0 rating. If it's the highest cost, it's 4 rating. Tooling costs, meaning if we had to pay for tooling so they can then make the product, it's very common in automotive. That the same kind of cost structure. Scoring, this is that supplier assessment score. What did they score on their assessment? Was it between 90 and 100 points? And then they got a 0 and so on. So low points wins in this rating system here, this matrix. Then whether they are a long-term agreement award winner, that was yes or a no. So we gave preference to those that we have long-term agreements to, and then proximity. So how far is this product coming from? So you would have the supplier names here in the next input section. At the top in the gray bars, supplier name, and then you would put the rated number of 0 through 4 based on where they fell in comparison to their competition as far as pricing goes, their score ranking, and so on. I'll give you an example here in a minute. Since this is an Excel-based system, when you'd enter your ratings in the input section, the analysis section and sourcing recommendation would automatically populate. Here's an example of what that looks like. So we had suppliers A through E, and we entered their ranking based on their quotations, based on their performance, based on their proximity, and then it spit out a bunch of numbers at the bottom in the analysis. According to this, the one we should be doing business with is supplier A, because they have the lowest total points. Because remember, the point value of 0 with the weight is more, it lowers the score, and that's what most preferred, lowest cost supplier, and with a 30% rating or a weight in the matrix there. So this is a clean way to numerically figure out what the best source could be. Now, what's missing from this snapshot is at the bottom here. There would be, right after the sourcing recommendation, the sourcing agent or buyer would then go through and evaluate these scores, explain whether or not they were going to pick supplier A, and sometimes we wouldn't go with the best score, and because maybe they've got too much business of ours, or there's a recent piece of information that it isn't captured in this matrix. There could be a multitude of reasons. In some cases, our customer directed us to the supplier and we didn't have a choice, but we went through this matrix and did our analysis for future reference. So this tool, very, very helpful. If you could drive it to numbers and facts over opinion and guesses, you're going to win every time. Once a supplier is selected, then you go through the process of reaching the agreement. We're going to talk about negotiation later on, but what we're talking about is reaching a formal agreement of terms and conditions, making sure everything is agreed to and how you're going to do business together, and even if things go wrong, what are you going to do about it? Then you make sure all the requirements are understood, signed, and ready to go prior to even sending an order over. We'd have this all the time. We'd try and jump the gun. We'd want product quickly, so we would place an order for it before the agreement was signed. Not smart. Don't do that. That's what gets you in trouble. And if necessary, we'll talk about legal later on. The legal stuff is coming up later, but involve legal up front before bad things happen or disagreements. Okay? From there, that is the closing out the sourcing of the process. Once you've decided on your source, you're done. You're good. You've selected the right source. Well, there are better ways to do this, as you can imagine. So, some process improvements on how to administer this. Well, have one place you put all the lists of your suppliers and the data and the information you collected from the evaluations, from your sourcing, matching them up to their options or opportunities that they sourced on and did or did not get. Have another party come in, and a third party come in and help guide you through this process. There are consultants that will do this. In fact, I've worked with a few in my time, and I've acted as one in my time. Whenever possible, I showed an Excel file, matrix. If you can make that an electronic process that is easily saved on your company's server instead of kept on someone's personal laptop or professional laptop or pieces of paper, do so. Make it as electronic as possible so it can be shared. And then, if possible, have template contracts and processes in place so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. One of the tips of avoiding having to deal with legal is have an approved legal contract by your legal team up front so you don't have to reinvent it every time. All right, so those are some best practices. Just to make sure we covered everything, we covered the steps to evaluation and selection. There's a lot of stuff in there. If you have questions, do reach out. Happy to talk to you about the madness and the fun of supplier selection, as well as how to come up with those key evaluation criteria and then the steps of creating those evaluation surveys and selection. And then we covered the best practices at the end. you have any questions, please feel free to reach out anytime. I love hearing from you. Look forward to our discussion activities. But in the meantime, have a great week.